We often wonder, can things in our country and our nation and in the world become even more divided than it already is? If you watch the news, particularly one day of the week or more, there's no doubt that you're aware that we live in a society that divides and conquers, feeds itself off the enmity that exists between individuals and races and peoples and religions. But what you may not realize is that this is not new under the sun. If you go back even in Jesus' day, they were dealing with the same issues of division that we find ourselves feasting in today. Yet it was the point of sending God's only Son, Jesus, and the Sermon on the Mount to share with us one of the greatest gleanings from Scripture we'll ever find, that is true understanding of reconciliation. How one brother who is at odds with a brother may find peace and love in that relationship once again, and that is the journey that we'll take in our message tonight. The first thing that we must understand, as I've just talked about, is the fact that the condition of the people, they were a divided group of people. The Jews, you might think, well, Jonathan, they were all together. They were on one page, but the truth is they were certainly not. Go back and study in the New Testament, learn about the sects of the Jews. And now even within their own race and their own culture, there was so much division and hatred. So little love was expressed one brother to another. It was all about ritual and routine, not about showing each other the love of God. So when Jesus spoke to those people, he found himself in front on that day, preaching the Sermon on the Mount in front of a divided group of people. But his message would be the point of unification that still is today the reason why we are God's family. So tonight, we're going to examine how Jesus took the world's definition of reconciliation, wiped it off the map, and gave us a brand new way to look at true reconciliation. One brother to another, one sister to a sister or brother. Tonight, I hope that you will follow me in this journey as we look at Jesus' message from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21 and ending in verse 26. That is the center text that we'll be looking at tonight. We'll also take a look at Ephesians and also Romans throughout this evening. The first step in understanding how Jesus changed the definition that people held of reconciliation, because in their mindset, if someone does something to you, it's even better to do something to someone else. If someone does something that harms you, harm them in return. Revenge. No idea of allowing God to be a part of nature and allowing God to affect his revenge. It was all about, if you cut off my arm, I'm cutting off your arm. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I would imagine that this emotion we're about to talk about in just a moment was the source of a great deal of division in that particular day and time. We're talking about anger. And the first thing that Jesus teaches on this lesson tonight is that we must find a way to diffuse our anger. I had a certain love and passion as a child. Every time that the New Year's Eve rolled around or July 4th rolled around, I wanted to buy what? Fireworks. And my dad always said, we're not wasting our money on those things. They're not worth it. But as a child, I got to have them. And I forget when I became a teenager and began working at Kmart that I saved up a paycheck and I went out and I bought all these fireworks. And we spent that night going and setting off all the fireworks, and I wondered, where did my paycheck go? What you may not realize, when I say diffuse your anger, just like that firework. If you don't light that fuse, if you don't light that spark, that flame to that fuse, there's not going to be any show, is there? How many times has anger gotten the better of you because you've allowed that fuse to be lit? And a lot of us, we have our buttons, don't we? We like to talk about, don't press my buttons. You know what to say, especially husbands and wives. If you've been together long enough, you know each other's tendencies, do you not? Do not have a long fuse or a short fuse. See, a lot of the time in life, it's all about how are you going to control your anger. I'm telling you, you can diffuse your anger. There are ways to diffuse your anger. Look at verse 22. This is out of the New American Standard. It says, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court." It's obvious that they were dealing with anger in Jesus' day. And he goes on to say in verse 22, now the New International Version, it says, that person will be subject to judgment. In other words, if you are a person who has that short fuse, or even a long fuse for that matter, and you are going to find a way, obviously, to become angry, you're putting yourself in danger, my friends. So I got to ask you, how many of you in this room have been angry in the last week? Stop and think about it. I got angry on the way to the office the other day. I was coming up Space Center. They blocked off traffic, couldn't move, sat there for 7-10 minutes, still no movement. I don't like that sort of thing. I don't like to drive and have every light turn green and everybody move out of my way. Don't you? Absolutely. But that day, it wasn't about that. It was about, let's put everything in front of Jonathan to slow him down. Somebody conspired to do that. It made me angry. But how did I deal with that anger? How did I deal with that anger that resided right there in my bosom? Did I decide to flare out and show everybody in Pasadena, Texas and Clear Lake, Texas, how my red hair could flame at a moment's notice? No. Because the first step when you're dealing with anger is you've got to be able to release your anger in a proper manner. Be angry, yet do not sin. That's easier said than it is done. But you've got to work on it. You know, when young Timothy was being mentored by Paul, he told him to practice these things. Because it takes practice to live a life where anger does not control you, where anger does not set you off at a moment's notice. And when you face that anger, you've got to learn some proper ways to deal with it. But it's not just about how to deal with it, it's when to deal with it. Because I want to also teach tonight that this particular sermon by Jesus is teaching us how to deal with our anger in an efficient fashion. Now, it says there in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, the latter half of that verse says, do not let the sun go down on your anger, right? A lot of us have a hard time understanding that quenching anger has to be done efficiently. What I'm not telling you is to take your anger and hold it inside. Because if anger resides in you long enough, it will eventually pour out in devastating ways. So, not too fast, not too slow. Find a pace of which you can control your anger. Of how you can let your emotion come forth from you without being too fast or too slow. Because I'm not telling you tonight that you have to sit in your life and never show any emotion or never be a person, because it does say, be angry. It says that. Be angry, but do not sin in the process. Even Jesus showed some indignancy to a group of people who were doing something they shouldn't have been doing in the temple. We see the result of that. We know he didn't sin, right? So next tonight, the one that none of us in this room are very good at. How do I know that? Because we're human. Nothing is tougher to tame than the tongue. Control your tongue. Look at verse 22. Anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in the danger of the fire of hell. If your anger and your emotion is such that whatever you're feeling inside just automatically pours out of you, it's a danger. How many of you have known somebody that did not have a filter? Whatever they were thinking, they were just going to say it. I've worked with some people over the years like that. I've been friends with a few people like that. And at time to time, I've even been the one to deal with that. We call it open mouth, insert foot. But I'm telling you tonight that we must work towards controlling our tongue. Why is it that we get in so many issues with brethren? Why is it that we have so much tumult, so much division, even sometimes in the church? You know why that is? Because we have a hard time thinking before we speak. We'd rather speak than listen any day. And yet we've got 2 ears and one mouth. You'd think we'd learn from that eventually. I want you first to realize our words, they judge other people. The words that you say will stand in judgment of other people. How many times have you said words of judgment to someone else that caused there to be issue in your relationship with that person? I know husbands, we've done it with our wives. Boy, we slept on the couch before, right? Because we opened our mouth and said something we shouldn't have said. And then after we thought about it, she was right, we were wrong. Right, guys? No, not any of you. But our words, they judge others. But we are not to stand as judges over other people. God is the ultimate judge. Do not be so careless with your tongue that in the process you make harsh judgment on other people. Why? By the same measure of judgment that you place on someone else, what will happen? That same measure is going to be applied to you by God. So the words that you speak are therefore judged by God. If you stop every time you're about to say something harsh and critical to somebody else, if every time you're about to open your mouth and expose the dirt, the filth of criticism and gossip, if every time you're about to employ that nature of your flesh, if every time you're about to do that, you stopped and you said, God, is what I'm about to say the right thing to say? I wonder how many times we'd actually say it. So let's talk about reconciling some differences tonight, and the lesson is yours. I like over this last few weeks, on these Tuesday nights, we've had our men's training class. I want to tell you, brothers and sisters, these men in this training class have done an excellent job. Ronnie Reinhardt, love you, brother. Got up here and led that scripture. Now, how many of you are blown away by that? I was. He hasn't been able to attend a single class, but he's been at home or work, and he's watched every single class, and he's worked on it. He sent me his prayer. He's really been invested in it, and you could tell it when he got up here to read the scripture tonight. That's the type of brother that I'm proud of. Step out in courage. I know you were shaking, Ronnie. I could see it. But that's okay. We all shake from time to time from up here. But we've been talking a lot about worship. But nothing hinders our worship anymore at the Waters Road Church of Christ than broken relationships. Cliff, you mentioned it this morning in your prayer. If anybody comes to worship God and they've got aught with their brother, it's going to affect their worship. Broken relationships, they do. They affect worship, and we must remember that. Look at verse 23. If you're presenting your offering, and remember that your brother has something against you. So at that moment, when you realize that there is a broken relationship, you've got a choice. Are you going to sit in the auditorium and ignore it? Or are you going to take the initiative to do something about it? And that's what I'm talking about tonight, in taking the initiative to reconcile. It says, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother. So let me ask you, what does God want more? For you to present Him your form of worship? Or does He want you to be reconciled with your brother? Now you read that scripture and you tell me the answer. Because when you attempt to worship God, when you've ignored broken relationships, you are hindering your ability for your worship to be pleasing to God. Finally tonight, under this topic of reconciling your differences, at some point you're going to have an adversary. Do you know what an adversary is? I think we do. At some point you're going to have somebody that's just not on your side. Somebody that doesn't really have a high opinion of you. Someone that's going to find and look for ways to criticize you and to find your issues and to find your weaknesses, and they don't mind pointing those out. But how do you live in this world knowing that not everybody's going to always be on your side, not everybody's going to be your biggest cheerleader? Let me tell you something. Over the years, some of my biggest critics have ended up being my best friends. You know why? Because if you follow what I'm telling you tonight, and you work to reconcile your differences, God's Spirit will get involved in that process. But a lot of us just go, well, they're never going to like me. They're never going to think very much of me, so that's not what God's Word's telling us here tonight. Look at verse 25. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. So it's gotten that bad? Really? It's gotten that bad that your adversary, they're going to take me to court? Now, what happens if you get summons to court, my friends? What does your heart begin to do? You tell me. Your heart rate goes up, you get a little bit nervous, because none of us in this room like the thought of having to go to court. But you know, if you continue reading there's a process by which you could possibly avoid that with your adversary. And I hope that a lot of us will go back and read this Sermon on the Mount to understand better what that means. But I'm telling you tonight that we must seek peace with all. You don't just have a group of friends and surround yourself with that group and say, oh, I love you, but I don't know you, and I don't really want to. You got to seek peace with all, even and including your adversary. Listen, if your biggest critic has a hard time finding something bad to say about you, consider yourself fairly lucky. Because if people look at you long enough, they can find your issues. Trust me. If people look at you long enough, they can pick you apart. But that's not what we're about. That's not what we are called to be. But if you face those, look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. That means when you find differences between you and your adversary, between your biggest critic, between someone you've became in enmity with, you've got one choice, only one choice. There is no other choice. You must reconcile those differences. Now, why did Jesus say all this? Because He was preparing God's children for what was to come. The time when Jesus Christ, through His death, burial, and resurrection, would unify us in a way that no one could ever have unified us. We don't make unity. The church does not make unity. Christ made unity. We are told to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. That means we've got to reconcile. So think about that this week as your life rolls along, your relationships continue. May God bless you to have great relationships that need no reconciliation. But if that comes that time, hopefully you'll follow Jesus' pattern and not man's. Let us now stand and sing together the song of invitation.